return now to our top story that the head of MI5 says the terrorist threat to the UK is now greater than at any time since 9/11. It comes as the government names and shames universities which allow platforms to radical Islamists and has written to the National Union of Students urging them to break links with controversial groups. One of those controversial groups is CAGE, and we're joined now by Ibrahim Mohamoud. CAGE says they're independent advocates but have been described as being apologists for terror. It's among the organisations which the government has urged the NUS to stop inviting to university campuses. Let's begin by asking, is there a place for the group CAGE, for people affiliated to it, to be addressing people at university campuses around the country?
Well, the issue really is not only CAGE. I mean, I think CAGE has been speaking for a number of years at university campuses. We're up and down the country. We're inundated with requests to speak as well. I think that's really healthy. It's really good that students want to have an inquisitorial mind, who want to challenge policy, challenge ideas, and that's what the purpose of universities are. And we don't want to see a country that has universities where it's been dictated to as to what they can and can't say.
But some of those speakers, they would dictate to others, wouldn't they? Yet here they are being given the freedom to espouse their views. Not
necessarily. I think we sometimes belittle students. I think we insult them, say that students can't challenge views that we feel that are irreprehensible, that are horrid, that we may disagree with. I think that's the point. We need to trust students to actually make those judgments themselves. And universities themselves, like in other institutions, have policies that regulate hate speech, that regulate speech that might incite racial or religious hatred. We have those laws, and we need to stick within the legal framework.
But widening this out in the context of a record number of people arrested on suspicion of links to terrorism, 6 attacks thwarted in the last 12 months. The terror threat, as Andrew Parker, the head of MI5, was saying, higher now than at any time since 9/11. Isn't it the case that your group creates the space in which these extremist views can be aired?
Absolutely not, Anita. I think what we've been doing is actually calling for a conversation, a dialogue as to how we end the cycle of violence. This country's gone through terrorism before. We've seen on British mainland 3,000 people were killed during the conflict in Northern Ireland, and we've never ever had the response we've had today. And the sad thing is, the security services' own intelligence officers have actually said that when Britain is involved in foreign conflicts, there's always going to be a natural backlash. What we want to see is an evidence-based approach where Britain and their allies look at the evidence, look at the situation on the ground, and to assess whether it's worth involving themselves in foreign conflicts.
But is CAGE going to end the cycle of violence or contribute to ending the cycle of violence when the group describes Mohammed Emwazi, for example, Jihadi John, as a beautiful young man, when it seeks to blame his actions on MI5?
We've never described Mohammed Emwazi as a beautiful young man. What we have said is what the school teachers, people who were around him at the time, well before he travelled to Syria, so that the Mohammed Emwazi pre-Syria was a person who was a beautiful man, not the Mohammed Emwazi of today. And we've actually called for Mohammed Emwazi to be prosecuted. If he's been accused of war crimes, as has been by a number of people who have been accused of war crimes, then he should be rightly brought to court as a war criminal.
But CAGE has sought to blame MI5 for what he then subsequently did.
Actually asks very difficult questions. Look, we live in a very difficult world. We live in a very difficult climate where there's a number of horrid things that happen in the world. What we need are rational heads and a level response. And what we have called for is for MI5 to actually...
radical speakers rational heads.
What we have called for
that is why the government wants to urge the NUS to not invite speakers like that to universities.
We've got two issues here. We need to put them side by side, Anita. On one hand, we want to speak about MI5. So MI5 have a role to play. No one's ever denied that. But what we want to actually encourage MI5 is to learn the lessons from actually pushing people and putting them in a situation where they feel that they can't remain in this country anymore. No, we don't want that to happen. On the issue of universities, well, like I mentioned before, universities have policies in hand for a number of years that mitigate the risk.
But are those policies working? I mean, I could read you out a list here of people who've committed terrorist-related offences while at a university, people who have been sent to prison and are thought to have been radicalised or partially radicalised while at university.
A lot of it is based on suspicion and hearsay. We've not actually had...
No.
Well, I can actually quote you. I've actually seen the same press release. From what I understand, there's only been 2 people who've been prosecuted and convicted while at university of committing terror-related offences, and that's that's a very small number. If you look at what Europol actually said recently, let me just finish on this point. Europol recently published their annual report looking at terrorists across the European continent. And out of all the terrorist offences that have been committed, only 0.3% were committed by those who espouse an Islamist background. So we actually need to look at things in proportion. There always will be criminality, but we need to have a rational, balanced and level-headed approach on how we tackle it. We all want to end conflict. We all want to end the cycle of violence.
Let me interject then. Is there therefore a place for radical speakers, just to get you to answer that point, in universities, for example?
Universities have had people who've called for the end of parliamentary democracy. We've had speakers who've called for the end of the monarchy. These are radical views, but they are still views that have been espoused. And what I would like to see is that is for ministers, for government, not to interfere in the running of universities and to dictate to them what is acceptable speech and what is not acceptable speech. What we want to see is legal speech, speech that doesn't harm people, doesn't call for the harm of others.
Are you confident that all the speakers affiliated to you are giving speeches that contain appropriate language, that are legal, that are not anti-British, etc.?
Well, I've never used anti-British as a definition of what is hate speech. What I have said is that the key distinction that universities have been using for a number of years, and I think it's for the universities and for students, for student unions and student groups to come together and to decide if they want to look at this thing again. What we have said is that we need to remain within the law. That hate speech, which calls for incitement of racial religious hatred, is intolerable, it's unacceptable. But at the same time, Anita, we can't have a climate where we actually dismiss views that are radical. We've had people, like I said, who've called for the end of parliamentary democracy, who've called for the end of the monarchy, who've called for a violent revolution, whether in this country or abroad. And we want to have...
Does Cage need to do more, though? People
I think
are calling
universities,
you apologists
I think
for
universities need to have a conversation with student groups, students, to say what they feel is the best framework to move forward. But what Cage has called for, Anita, like I've mentioned for a number of occasions right now, Cage has always called for ending a cycle of violence by the use of dialogue, by looking at the issues that we have, and to actually see, well, how can we stop people, like we said, being involved in acts of criminality. That's what we've called for. It's a very simple message that I think resonates with all reasonable people.
We must leave it there. Ibrahim Mohamoud from Cage, thank you.
Thank you, Nita.